So I have somewhat of a lofty goal, fall protection, the greatest challenge in compliance and risk. And the way this presentation came about is Sam Reese and I were having a conversation, and he said, you know, I've been doing some research, you know, comparing some data between the United States and Europe, and you know, this is what I'm coming up with. And I said, well Sam, you know, I presented something similar to it over in the UK at the London Work at Heights seminar back in 2019, and I think that that's going to resonate. And so we continued on our conversation. So I want to thank Sam for the invitation. I also want to thank Jackie for all the hospitality that she provided to get me here. But Forrest Esther came up to me last night during the reception and said, you know, Thom, what is your message to this group? Because when I, you know, my first slide is, you know, serious injuries and fatalities, it is a huge focus in the safety industry, as you well know. And obviously one of those areas is falls, and there's no group that understands gravity greater than you guys, right? You guys understand it, and one of the reasons why I love it is because it's the only area of health and safety that we've been exposed to every day of our life. But also, secondly, there are only two fears that a human is born with: the fear of loud noises and the fear of falling. Okay, so we have that fear in it, but again, how does that get back to compliance? And so my response back to Forrest last night was put yourself in the shoes of people that are using only fall protection equipment, not what you guys are typically doing, because you're typically using fall protection equipment in you know, adjacencies to what else is being done. So I think there's opportunities, because when people are simply just using equipment, and I'll give a couple examples a little bit later in my presentation, I think there are significant gaps. You understand, and this is in line with a UK study that I'll share a little bit later, you guys understand how you have to have all your processes in place, whether it's procedures, supervision, and training to make sure that that person accomplishes their work at heights in a safe manner. I'm not sure if the rest of the industry is really there yet, and I'm going to share with you some statistics related to that. So I think the question that we need to realize is that, do we understand the risks from heights, falls from heights, but more importantly, do we understand fall protection? And when I say fall protection, I'm referring to just the PPE side, right? I'm not talking about just broadly the access industry and so forth. So that's the terms that I want to think about, and I'm going to share a couple examples where I think, and the conclusions I've come to, is that our use of the PPE side isn't quite where it needs to be, and what are how can we address that? So my bottom line up front, in line with that, is that we need to rely less on personal protective equipment. I'm not saying send people out there without the PPE, but I'm saying that if it comes down to the PPE, we have to realize that in many cases, our workers are simply one mistake away from a fatality, and that's a bad day. And again, when we look at broadly in the use of PPE, we can see that. So really what we need to do is we need to focus on system redundancies and processes first, and we need to focus on training second. This is very much in line with Edward Demings, that if you've ever studied quality, Edward Demings back in the 50s and 60s revolutionized quality, and he focused on the system redundancies. Just look up something from his red bead experiment, and it's really transforming as far as how you think about quality, and I think there's some connections when we think about it from a safety standpoint. So to give a little context for my presentation, I have to give you a little history lesson. And so I start my history lesson back in 1995. Any thoughts why I go back to 1995 for my history lesson when it comes to fall protection and safety? What happened in 1995 for the U.S. construction market? Fall protection regulation, right? Subpart M. Subpart M came into effect. So why does OSHA create regulations? And no sarcastic comments, please. In reality, why does OSHA create their regulations? They create them for accidents, because accidents happen, but what are they trying to do with their regulations? Yeah, prevent them from happening. They're trying to prevent the fatalities and the injuries from happening. By creating the regulation, does that automatically happen? Absolutely not. You have sessions like this where we talk about the regulations. You have people buying new equipment to address the regulations. You have people doing training, and you have the compliance officers out there. So just because they create a regulation doesn't change it. But here's the statistics since OSHA put forth their new regulation. So back in 1995, we had 643 fall fatalities. Last year, or the most recent data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we had 880. My question to you is, how are they doing? What's that? Not too well, right? And so we have to look at that. Well, let's look at the data. Let's zoom in on that 2008, 2009, 2010 time frame. If we could just replicate what we did those years, maybe we could drive down the numbers. Does anybody remember what happened back in 2009, 2010? There was no business, right? So if the only way we can reduce the number of fatalities is by having no business, that's not a system for success. So we can't replicate that. We don't want to replicate that. So how can we drive them down? And now the number of serious injuries with days away from work have gone down, but still this benchmark indicator of fatalities has not gone down. So again, it makes us reflect back on why does this happen. And as chair of the ANSI's E359 committee, I'm committed to that. Now I'm not speaking on behalf of the committee today, but still that's what keeps me up at night is why do these fatalities continue to go up? So let's look at a couple things that what has changed since then. So since 1995, we had essentially one fall protection regulation. Now we have 4. I include subpart L in there because, right, it's a working at height method, and so we're protecting those workers at height. We also have subpart D and I, which came out about 5 years ago from OSHA, so we take that into account. So we had 1, now we have 4. The ANSI standards, and I'm just focusing primarily on the A10 series and the Z359 series, we were about 100 pages back in 1995. Now we're 1,000 pages and growing. So we've increased the number of regulations, we've increased the number of standards. The amount of money spent on PPE, again, this is just the harnesses and the lanyard side. It was about a $300 million industry back in 1995. It's roughly an $800 million industry now, and it's growing. It's probably eclipsed $1 billion either now or in the future. So the amount of equipment has grown significantly. We can't say anymore that there's a shortage on equipment or people just don't have the equipment. Everyone's got a harness now if they want to have one. And for citations by OSHA, fall protection has been the #1 citation for the past 10 years, and when you look at the top 10, 4 or 5 of those relate somehow to fall protection. So more regulations, more standards, more equipment, more citations, and oh, by the way, overall workplace fatalities have decreased. So our workplaces are getting safer from a fatality standpoint, and yet when you compare the numbers between 1995 and 2007, or I'm sorry, 2019, and it's not a smooth fit line, we see an increase of 37%. So again, when I look at my day job at LJB, when I look at my volunteer job as chair of the ANSI's E359 standard, this is something that should not be. We need to address this. And then I gotta look at some other data, this goes back to why I think we understand the risk of falls from heights, but we don't understand the fall protection. One other comparison I want to make is looking between the United States and United Kingdom. Very, very similar economies, different regulatory frameworks, so I'm not trying to get into those details or propose anything related to the framework, but when you look at us, obviously we're a much larger economy than the United Kingdom, no doubt about that. From a population size, we're about 5 times larger than the United Kingdom, but when you look at all these numbers, obviously we're going to have higher numbers than the United Kingdom. But the last number is really what caught my mind. In 2016, when we had 849 fatalities, they had 25. And granted, there's ways that they count numbers that there are slight differences, but that's getting in single digits of percentages as far as why we're different. But when you look at this, we have about 3 to 6 times the number of fatalities after you correct for a size of economy, population, whatever you want to do. And to me, that just should not be. We are too similar of a culture that we should be able to replicate that. So my goal as ANSI chair isn't to get it down to 0. I would be happy just getting us down to that next plateau, because there are seriously hundreds of workers that don't go home to their families and are put in a coffin every year. And that's not including the number of workers with serious injuries with days away from work. And so that's why I'm happy to speak here, because I think the answer is partly in this room as far as how we can do that better, and I'll get into that in a little bit here. So I think part of this gets to where do we focus? Where do we focus our efforts? And very, very similar to what Tim was talking about as far as fixing up your house, always having it in that ready to move, ready to sell type case. The same thing applies to our fall protection programs out there. And so many years ago, the ANSI Z359 standards, we just had Z359.1. It didn't apply to construction. It was roughly 100 pages. Now we have a variety of standards, not only focused on managing a fall protection program, but also how to design properly fall protection systems. How do you test equipment components? We have all the equipment components in different standards, from harnesses all the way to anchorage connectors. And then now we finally have taken away our exemption of construction, and so we now include construction within ours. And we're getting to 1,000 pages. Okay, so that's a benchmark where the Z359 fall protection code has gone. And we've never had more robust equipment. I'm not saying that those 1,000 pages aren't filled with value. They are filled with value. The equipment that your folks use out in the field has never been more robust, and that is a good thing. There are people, there are your employees that have gone home to their families because of these innovations in the fall protection equipment. But what I want you to pull to is the United Kingdom back in 2019 published a report by what they call their all-party parliamentary group. It'd be kind of like our having a congressional subcommittee on working at height. Is anybody going to laugh at that, having a congressional subcommittee on working at height? It would never happen here in the United States, right? But when you look at our data, it's like, wait a second, they're having it, but we're not. Obviously, there's I'm not trying to make this into a political conversation. There's other things that they're arguing about, some of them that are important, some of them that are irrelevant. But the point is that how can we take some of their information and apply it to our workplaces? And so what they concluded in their causes and consequences of falls was really just 3 items. What is the culture of the organization, and how does that apply? How does that affect the issues as far as exposing workers at heights? What is the behavior that the workers are doing out in the field that can cause these incidents? And then finally, the combination of the organization and the individual, what kind of competence do we have in the field working out there to protect those workers at heights? What I would say is that in our Z359 standards, we added a 4th cause and consequences of falls from heights and incidents. We added one of equipment failure. And the most dramatic way you can think about that is just the snap hook gate strength that we proposed back in 2007 that OSHA finally adopted back in 2016 when they published the new subpart DNI. We also in 2012 proposed this leading edge SRL. And I'll have some comments a little later about leading edge SRLs. But what I would say is that in making the equipment more robust, did it have an unintended consequence of making of organizations thinking that the equipment is so robust, I can maybe take my training and maybe make it a little lower because the equipment is so robust that it would overcome any mistakes that the worker would have. And so I think there's some unintended consequences of focusing too much on the equipment failure and not on the fundamental items. And again, that's why I go back to Deming. The fundamentals of quality is focus on the process. Now, granted, you're going to have individuals that make bad decisions, sometimes purposely, sometimes accidentally, but you're still going. You can't avoid those mistakes out in the field. I've made probably a dozen mistakes already. If my wife Tracy was here next to me, she would say, "Well, you forgot about this and this and this." And the point is that we are going to make mistakes. We're humans, and so those mistakes will happen. It's just when they do make that mistake, are we going to allow it to be a fatality? So that gets into this question. When you think, and you said, well, I haven't had an incident, my follow-up question to you is, well, is that because you're good, or is that because you're lucky? And very, very similar to where Tim brought up those 8 items, to do some due diligence related to those, even if you aren't selling, just to have a better awareness of your program. If you think you're good, show me why you're good. You should be able to point to very, very specific items, and I'll mention in a little bit here the ANSI Z359.2 standard on a managed approach to fall protection that will allow you to do a check against a well-known standard. So just as a manufacturer uses the Z359.11 standard to evaluate their full body harnesses, you can use the Z359.2 standard to evaluate your fall protection programs to see if you are good or maybe you're just lucky. And the next big item will come in the near future. So when I think about fall protection, this is really the fundamental part as far as why I think we struggle with it so much. It's some research by Daniel Kahneman that he came out years ago. He talked about this system 1, system 2 thinking. When I say system, I don't mean a fall protection system. I meant just in your brain framework, how you think about things. So the best way to explain system 1 thinking is that if anybody drove here, or think about the last time you drove to the office, or maybe with COVID, that's not a great example, but let's think about the last time you just drove your car somewhere. Did you remember every single action that you took while driving that vehicle? And the likelihood is not. You didn't. And it's not that you were being unsafe. It's just you have done it so much is that there's an intuitional and instinctual aspect to it. Plus, you have very well established driver's ed that you went through at some early part of your career, so that ingrained certain things. And you have insurance rates that if you make a lot of mistakes, those insurance rates will come up, so you have some incentives to drive safely. You have police officers out there that are going to give you a ticket if you speed too much or if you swerve too much. You have other vehicles that if you do that same stuff and there's not a police officer, you'll get a little beep from the horn. And New York City a lot more, but maybe less here in Ohio. But the point is that there's an active system of supervision, of processes, of training that is really driving you to be safe. And we think about 19 minutes out of 20 minutes, we're in that instinctual phase, and only 1 minute we're in that rational. And so my question to you is, when it comes to using fall protection equipment, and again, this is really a question beyond this room. It's more for the adjacent industries where they're only using fall protection equipment and they're not using access equipment. Do those workers have the proper training? Do they have the proper supervision? Do they have the proper procedures? Are those processes robust enough so that all that work is intuitional and instinctual? And I would say in many cases, not all, but many cases, it's not. And so that's why we continue to have all these fatalities and all these serious injuries, because they just simply don't have that robustness that's needed to protect them. So how does this come out, and what are things that you can actively do out there in the field? Well, this is one question that you can ask anybody on your job sites, and you can start to have a great conversation about fall protection. So the one of two questions that you can ask is how do you clean your gutters, and how do you put up your holiday lights? And I got to say thank you to Sean Smith, who is the Director of Safety over at NAVC in the DC area. He's the one that came up with this question. And so think about it this way. When I clean my gutters, I have a leaf blower, and I have about 6 tubes that are duct taped together with a gooseneck at the top and a little funnel at the end of it, and I'm able to clean my gutters on my 2-story house with my feet firmly planted on the ground. Now, my sons laugh at me when I first did it. My wife laughs at me. Why do we have to do it that way? I happen to live on a golf course, and so people teeing off are looking at me like, what the heck is that guy doing? But it's not because I'm scared of heights. It's just because I have a healthy respect of heights. And as much work that I can do with my feet on the ground is good. When I put up my holiday lights, I have an aluminum pole, 16-foot pole. I put a broom head on it, and I can put lights 20 feet high on my trees. I just make sure it's not lightning, and I'm safe to do it. And again, it's not because I'm scared of heights, it's because I have a healthy respect of heights. Now, we have people that keep their feet on the ground. We have people also that do the work off a ladder. It's perfectly fine. It's safer than alternatives. But we also have a group that do what? What are they doing to clean their gutters and put up their holiday lights? They're jumping on the roof. And the reason, or the way that they're doing it isn't the important item. The thing I want you to think about this, and when you're having that conversation with people in the field, is why are they doing it that way? Why are my sons, when they have a 2-story house, they're going to take some pieces of duct tape, take some pieces of tube, duct tape them together, and use a blower to blow out their gutters? Why are they going to do it that way? Because that's what they saw from me. And so the reason why people do it this way is because they've been taught by somebody who loves them how to do it. It was a sibling, it was a parent, it was a relative, it was a grandparent. Somebody taught them that. And so you simply just reading OSHA, or somebody that you have training your folks, just reading OSHA to say, this is what thou shalt do according to OSHA, that's why it doesn't resonate with them. That's why they walk to the roof edge and do something for 2 minutes, is because, they've done it before, and people said just do it as long as you're safe. And so we have to overcome, in the fall protection industry, we have to overcome that mindset as far as what is acceptable and what is risk. And until you have that conversation with folks out there in the field, and especially the folks in the adjacent industries to you, then we're not going to get to the understanding as far as what is fall risk. The next thing I want you to think about is PPE, and compare it to other personal protective equipment that you use. We all got hard hats, right? We all have safety glasses. We all have steel-toe shoes or work boots, right? Those are the other forms of PPE that we're often using in our workplace. Just a quick show of hands, who wore shoes today? Come on, everyone's got to get their hand up, right? So the point isn't whether or not you're wearing your shoes, but if you have a worker that doesn't know how to put on safety shoes, construction boots the proper way, you got bigger issues. If you have somebody that doesn't know how to put on safety glasses, I mean, everyone wears prescription glasses or sunglasses. If you have a worker that doesn't know how to put on safety glasses the right way, you got bigger issues. But with a show of hands, how many people use fall protection equipment outside the workplace? Come on, there's got to be, okay. Yes, sir, in the blue. Why do you wear fall protection outside the workplace? Okay, so you're a hunter. You get in a tree stand, and I'm not sure if this applies to you, but sometimes there's some beverages that are consumed when you're out there. Sometimes you get out there really, really early, right, and you're still a little tired. So there's multiple reasons why you wear that, but that's a safety item, right? You have other people that jump out of perfectly good airplanes, right? You have other people that do recreational climbing, but those are typically the three. And when you looked at the room to see how many people, it was probably less than 5%. And the point is that people don't know what good is when you use a full body harness. And so we have to have our systems, our processes that are robust enough to address what that is. And one thing that I think fundamentally could change our culture when it comes to using fall protection equipment is require that everyone goes through a professional fitting of the harness, and that they go through a suspension. I'm not meaning a suspension 60 feet in the air. You kind of, take them to the top part of the scaffold and kind of let them hang with 60 feet underneath them. Don't do that. Obviously, that's not good. That's not good practice. Simply just have a tripod, have a hoist, bring them up so that the tension is on their harness, and let them just take their feet up. And if they're comfortable with that, then bring them up a couple inches and let them freely suspend. Nothing says proper rescue or proper harness fitting and prompt rescue than going through a suspension. And the first time they should do it is when they're just a couple inches off the ground versus 60 feet in the air. But when you think about, again, all the population out there that are using full body harnesses, how many of them do you think had a proper fitting and had some sort of a suspension as part of their training? A very, very small percentage. The reason why that really resonated with me the first time I went to an equipment manufacturer for some fall protection training, this was back when we actually took jumps. And so what they had was they had a set of scaffolding. Obviously, we're on a plank. They had a safety net down below in case somebody decided to jump early. There was a safety net they would go into. But there was nothing but guys in this group. And we were all thinking who could rip out our lanyard the most. That was our goal. And I was about 280 pounds at the time, so I thought, you know what, I'm willing to do this. I think I can do this. And this was back then, again, when we did jumps. We don't do it nowadays because of pre-existing conditions, but it was common back then. And so the first guy goes up to the edge. He's tied off, and he's actually going to jump, right? Put some vertical into it to get as much impact as he could. He impact, every guy looked at his face, and we tightened down our leg straps one more notch. Why did we do that? What's that? Yeah, to save it and to not talk so high for a couple minutes, right? There is a video, or not a video, but a couple images online. I don't use it in these presentations and so forth because I don't think it's needed, and sometimes describing it can be just as impactful, no pun intended. But let's just say it takes surgery to repair in some cases. Those straps will go where they want to go. And so a third factor to add into that professional fitting, that suspension, is are those workers fit to be working at height? And it's just not physical, it's also mental. We all know that person that starts working at height, that we say this person is completely uncomfortable working at heights. Or at the other end of the spectrum, the person that's really, really comfortable. And the reason why that really resonated with us was a couple years ago, we were doing some training for an electrical utility along the Northeast corridor, and a gentleman came up after our training and said, "I hated your training." And fortunately, we don't get that comment enough, or unfortunately, we don't get that comment very often. But we said, we always want to improve. What can we do more of, less of, or differently? He says, "I hate the fact that I now have to wear a harness every time I climb a pole. I hate it." And we said, well, time out. 1910-269 requires you to wear a harness. Your employer adopted 1910-269, so as they say, don't shoot the messenger. But his point was he loved that risk. And getting back to that previous question, you have to identify what those individuals are, because they are the ones that are going to be taking a lot more risk, and have the conversations and have the observations and supervisions of them, that they're not doing that willy-nilly. So again, fall protection is not your average PPE. Last one that really applies to you more than anyone else in the industry, and you'll understand this a lot more, is think about what are the origins of modern fall protection equipment. Who are the first users of modern fall protection equipment? The pictures I've seen of, say, New York City, they're not using anything. So the ironworkers is a common answer, but that's not the case. What's that? Paratroopers, yeah, they're using harnesses. I'm thinking more of occupational areas, though. What's that? Wire loggers, right? They're climbing up the tree, right? They have their belt on. They have their belt. They have their lanyard that goes over. They have their gaffs. They can't do their job without at least that belt and that lanyard, right? They can't work hands-free. They can't do their equipment if they didn't have that tool. Also, utility pole climbers, window cleaners, right? That's very, very common that they have to use it. They can't get to that work location. So fall protection fundamentally started as a tool for access. And then what we did was we took that tool for access and we said, well, you know what? We can protect everyone with tools that are similar to that. So let's just make this fall protection industry. And now we have a complex industry. I was having a conversation with someone earlier this week talking about the number of SKUs when you look at all the different manufacturers and all the different products that they have. So look broadly across all the fall protection equipment manufacturers, think about all the SKUs that they have, and you're probably approaching something in the tens of thousands, if not 100,000 SKUs, which means we have a very, very complex industry. How do you expect that person who maybe only has an hour, 2 hours, 4 hours of training can comprehend what to do, and then you have all these innovations? So it's become a very, very complex industry. And the reason why this is important is if that logger or that window cleaner or that utility pole climber, if they made a mistake with their fall protection system, what happened? What happened if they fell? What happened if they forgot to hook in that snap hook to the D-ring, even though it was a non-locking snap hook? What happened? They died or they were severely injured, right? Now you can have a worker using their fall protection equipment for 20 years, but as long as they don't fall, what are they considered? They're considered safe. And so we have to deal with this issue, that just because you haven't fallen, is it because you're good or is it because you're lucky? And that's the conversation that we have to have within our work at heights industry, is how are we making sure that we have all those procedures, that supervision, and that training that's really supporting that worker out there in the field. So again, that gets back to this System 1 and System 2 thinking that we really need to step back and really challenge our industry to think differently. And fundamentally, I think what will happen is we'll realize that many times we're putting people in harnesses and lanyards, and they shouldn't be in a harness and a lanyard. Somebody from the UK once gave me an example that over there, if someone's doing a steel erection project and they're simply just walking the steel and they could be using an articulating lift instead, they'll get fined by their HSE, their version of our OSHA. On the other hand, because they talk about the hierarchy of control in their regulation, on the other hand over here, if we see a steel erector with a full body harness on and you know, tied off with a cheater cable and a lanyard and they're walking steel, but they could be using an articulating lift, everyone's going to say, great, they're using fall protection. And I'll show you in a bit here what happens when somebody takes a fall off a piece of steel like that. And even though the fall is captured, what does a person necessarily walk away? So the mindset that we need to be thinking of is safety is not the absence of accidents. But when you're talking to folks in this industry, we need to be talking that safety is a presence of defenses. Stop seeing safety as an outcome and start seeing safety as a capacity. How much capacity do you have when that worker makes that mistake that's either going to result in a fatality or it's not? And so again, that comes through those procedures, the training and the supervision to make sure that we're addressing that. And as I mentioned before, the ANSI Z359.2 standard is a great way to improve your fall protection program and for others to improve that because it focuses on core elements that you can use from a plan, do, study, act. And again, that's the Deming model from years ago. Some people say plan, do, check, act. Deming didn't say check, he said study. And I think that focuses more on what they're going to and how they're addressing the system versus just plainly checking. And ASSP does do a course. I have to say this because not only I'm an at-large director for ASSP, but I also teach the course, so transparency for that situation, but it is available from ASSP. So let's talk about some specific examples where we see this and how we might be able to look at things a little differently. So this testing of equipment going through the edge, I don't need to explain to you why we don't simply allow equipment go over the edge. You all know it. I mean, you guys see these issues every day. But back in 2006, BG BAU, which is the German social insurance organization, they did some testing where they dropped not only wire rope, but also synthetic rope and lanyard, self-retracting devices, vertical lifelines over edge. And lo and behold, what happened? Some of the devices severed, right? Not surprising, right? You guys, again, deal with this every day. But other folks, whether it's a steel edge, whether it's decking, whether it's concrete, it was something new to them. So what do we do here in the United States when we're faced with something like that? We say, well, you know what? We can address it. We can address it through just robustness of standards. So here's a standard test method. This is a figure right out of our ANSI Z359.14 standard on self-retracting devices. This is how we test a self-retracting device. It's overhead. That is classically how a self-retracting device was always imagined to be used, overhead. Very efficient, very great product in that case, probably the best option in many cases. But then we said, you know what? We can modify that test method and let's drop that equipment over the edge. And that'll show people that it's safe. But are we just talking about the robustness of the product, or are we talking about a situation out there in the field? Are we just dropping a test weight? We're out there in the field. Is that actually human that's going over that edge? And one item I want to point out to this is that when you look at the 2005 UK's work at heights regulation, again, this is kind of comparing them, they actually prohibit equipment to be used in this way. From my understanding, when the EN standards were creating for self-retracting device a test very, very similar to this, the British standard says, you know what, we're going to protest. And we're not going to allow this to happen because we don't think fundamentally it is safe. So it's just interesting how they handled the issue versus how we handled the issue. So I think this figure is very, very helpful to think about it because it's not, as the previous picture looked like, it's not just a rigid test weight that's 282 pounds, but we actually have a person there. And this is an example of that. This is from an ad from a fall protection equipment manufacturer. Now, the two caveats that I'll add is that based on the standard, how we tested in the standard, everything that, that this manufacturer is implying by this picture is out of the scope. We have two dimensions. We have the setback, which is if we have the edge here, the setback is how far away from the edge. And in general, the further away from the edge, it's going to be better just from a geometric standpoint. We also have the offset. That is the distance from the edge, from the anchorage point, in a perpendicular manner, how much. And obviously that affects the swing fall. It also affects a slicing action. We also, in the ANSI standard, we also only specify one edge, which is a steel edge. So in all three factors, this manufacturer in this advertisement is outside the scope of the ANSI Z359 standard. And the reason why that's important is because they're, in essence, by advertising in this way, what are they saying? It's okay to do it. So that's why people out there in the field say, well, it must be okay. Okay? So that's one example. This is a wire rope of a lanyard, a wire rope lanyard that passed the test. What do you think about that wire rope? Still plenty of capacity left in that? Absolutely not. So this is what we see out in the field, which is very, very common. Okay? But what I want you to see is I want you to see a situation as far as somebody actually using this equipment. So this is Milwaukee Bucks Stadium. John Corvo from Lighthouse Safety, who's been a longtime member of the ANSI Z359 standard, was providing some safety product for that area and said, you know what, I want to do a little demonstration. And so what he did was he got one of these, Rescue Randy type folks and put 282 pounds of sand in it, has a full body harness. We're not talking about cutting the material on the edge in this picture, but my question to you after you look at this picture is, did this person walk away from this fall? The fall's captured, the person's not going to hit the ground, or the Rescue Randy fall protection dummy's not going to hit the ground. But did this person walk away? And if not, why not?
1, 2, 3.
So is that person walking away from that fall? What kind of injuries do they potentially have? Broken leg, maybe a dislocation of the hip. That would be really painful, right? Bruised ribs, maybe even cracked ribs, maybe even a punctured lung, maybe a shoulder dislocation. Yeah, the harness not fit properly, right? That's another issue that we can get into. Their face probably went by those edges. We could possibly have concussion, facial injuries, things like that. How long do we have to rescue this person that is now potentially unconscious? Who knows? So my point is that yes, we can make equipment that can robustly go over it, and robust equipment is awesome. I love the robustness of equipment. As an engineer, I love thinking about those factors of safety. But as a safety professional, I have to look at this situation and say, this is something we have to avoid at all costs. Right before COVID, I was talking to one of the manufacturers that sell these LE devices. He says the hottest selling product that they have are these LE devices. The year-over-year sales of these devices is through the roof. And if people are buying them because they want to have robust equipment, I'm all for it. But if they think that this is something that if we address through equipment failure and it allows their folks to be much more flexible and just kind of let them do whatever they want, I'm not for that. We have to separate the robustness of the equipment versus the hazards that we're seeing out there in the field and make sure that the workers are properly protected. So here's a couple items that you might think about if you're using LE's devices on the edge. I term this a survivability input. These aren't the only factors, but these are the main factors. The worker weight. Back on several years ago on the ANSI committee, we one time asked the equipment manufacturers, what's the biggest you've ever been asked to make a harness for? And one manufacturer shared 425 pounds. That's a big person. And when you think about not only how much energy that's putting into the fall protection system, but then you have to rescue the person. We have to think about setback. Typically, setback greater is better. Offset greater tends to be more severe. Then we have the equipment side. What's the line constituent? You have devices not only made out of webbing, but also wire rope. And based on all the tests that I've seen, I would tend to personally myself, I wouldn't use a webbing one. because I think that there's just, when you think about burrs, when you think about the abrasiveness of concrete edges, there's a lot of concern that I have related to that. Again, it might pass the test, but how does that test replicate what you're seeing out there in the field? Different types of energy absorbers, different types of brakes, the line constituent that strikes the edge, tolerances associated with it. One manufacturer found that when they tested their leading edge device, when they tested the wet version of it, so when we have ANSI tests, we have just an ambient test, we have a wet test, we have a dry test, and we have a cold test. And so during the wet test, their devices got submerged longer than required by the standard. I'm sure if anybody's familiar with testing, that occasionally happens. When it was submerged longer than the requirement by the standard, it actually severed. And doing their due diligence, they found that the brakes was swelling, and that swelling, if that's the brake part, what's going to happen? That's going to increase the frictional force, which is going to increase the deployment force, which is going to make that wire rope more susceptible to a failure. And so there's a lot of items that we need to think about, that you need to think about as you're using this equipment out in the field. One other item that I want to have people think about, challenge people think about when they're out there in the field, I know that sometimes the owners impose on you requirements to say, you shall use this piece of equipment, you can't use those. I think for good organizations, that's taking options off the table, and that's not a good thing. But the common item is using these personal SRLs, as we've started to call them, versus a twin leg lanyard. And the personal SRL is often sold as a safer alternative. In an overhead application, it's absolutely going to be the safer alternative in nearly every case. But once that anchorage starts to get lower, and how we typically describe it, and I'm sure you've seen this, is that when you have a personal SRL attached to your back, think about the jumping jacks, right? Think about where could I possibly use as an anchorage? And too often times, that's within reaching distance, and so we'll have a lower anchorage. And so there is a battery of tests that the lanyard is required to go through that the personal SRLs, up until about a month ago, haven't been required to go through. Okay? Plus the cost per unit is higher. And so that's one reason why they sell it as an alternative, right? The people out there selling this equipment, they are incentivized based on certain metrics in many cases. And we need to keep in mind that they are biased. I think they truly intend to make the workplace safer, and I think that's what they're doing. But they also are incentivized, and we need to be sure that we're conscious as users of fall protection equipment of where those incentives are. So as I finish up, I do have some time for questions, but some things I want to leave you with is that when you're out in the field, we need to think about, and you need to encourage folks in the adjacent industries where they're using fall protection much more, is visualize the outcome. Have them visualize if they have a foot level tie-off, what's going to happen. Have them visualize if they don't have a properly fit harness, what's going to happen. If you don't think they have enough clearances, talk them through and help them visualize that issue relative to clearances. I think it'll encourage safer ways to find work, to do work, plus I think it'll encourage the harness fittings more so. And then another one, the first one's from Dan Henn from Reliance Fall Protection. This next one is from Dan Henn also. Anchorage, higher is often better. We need to stop putting our anchorages at the foot level. We need to get our anchorages up above. Nearly every outcome when it comes to measuring the success of a fall protection, use of fall protection equipment, nearly every outcome is better when you have the higher anchorage. Forces are going to be less. Your free fall is going to be less. Your clearances are going to be less. You're more likely to be able to self-rescue. You don't have to worry about compatibility. You don't have to worry about your equipment cutting on an edge. All these items is something important. And then something I didn't spend a lot of time about, but documentation of our anchorages. If you look back to the earlies, 1995 when OSHA Subpart M came out, they said, either a 5,000-pound anchorage or 2 times a resting force. And Z359 back in 2007 clarified that 5,000-pound anchorage is what we call a non-certified anchorage, and the one by a qualified person is a certified anchorage. So we clarified that term. In 2017, when we republished Z359.2, we said that the only time you should use a non-certified anchorage is when the program administrator, the qualified person, the competent person, and the authorized person come together and do a rudimentary analysis and identify what is acceptable. and it's only when certified anchorages are not feasible. And you could argue in 1910.27, where OSHA puts higher requirements on rope descent systems, you can see how they're encouraging more documentation of our anchorages. And I think one of the reasons why we have so many incidents is because we have what we call improvised anchorages, where you give the worker a harness and a lanyard and you say, go out there and be safe. And they're identifying these anchorages all by their lonesome. And while documentation, as you well know, documentation doesn't make the system safer, the process of creating the documentation is really what's going to be the key to creating those safe captures out there in the field. So quick item from history. I started out with history. I'll end a little bit from history. March 25, 2015, Joe Rance was working on the floating bridge project out there in Seattle. He had just gotten a promotion, was going to go build the light rail system out in Honolulu. He was working in a bridge situation, fell on an ANSI-rated self-retracting device, one that was not rated for a leading edge. His lanyard contacted a leading edge, severed, and he fell down to his death. Walter Burroughs was also working on a transit project out in the Seattle area. He was working on a pier cap, right? I think they were either landing beams or they're getting ready to land some beams for the bridge structure. And rather than choosing a higher anchorage, he chose a foot-level anchorage with an ANSI-rated piece of equipment that was not rated for a leading edge. The webbing contacted that concrete edge, severed, and Walter, the grandfather in that picture, 63 years old, fell to his death. Walter was a supervisor. And what that tells me is that if the supervisor isn't doing things right, what about the rest of the people on the crew? Brian James Daunt, age 45, back in January of 2019, was building a structure in Bakersfield, California. He was using a self-retracting device rated by ANSI, or not rated by ANSI, but that was stated to meet the ANSI Z359 standard. Just to clarify, ANSI does not, and ASSP does not rate any of this equipment. It's a self-certification by the manufacturers. But he was using a device that stated that it did meet the leading edge requirements. When he fell, his webbing device struck that leading edge, steel beam edge. He was an iron worker, and it severed and he went down to his death. Obviously, there's a lot of factors as you look into the survivability input that I shared before that could go into that. I'm not saying that the equipment was faulty. I'm just saying that it was rated for an edge. It did sever, and that's something we have to look at and say, why did that happen, and how can we prevent something like that happening? So from here, from history, here again is three pieces of equipment where the manufacturer stated it meet ANSI, and unfortunately it related, they had a tragic circumstance here. So as I close, I leave you with a thought exercise. And I'll explain why I have May 22nd here in a minute. But imagine every year on May 22nd, precisely at 10:15, all of your workers simultaneously tested their fall protection systems. And again, I want you to think beyond just your workers. Think about the other workers on the job sites where you're working. Think about workers in the adjacent industries. They all fell. What would happen? Would we be good, or are we hoping that we're lucky? And the reason why I chose May 22nd is because I got a phone call from a construction manager at an organization that actually is just up the road from us now. They were building a water treatment plant back in 1998. So I got a call May 22nd, 1998. I remember it so distinctly because it was the Friday before the holiday weekend. He said, Tom, we had a fall down in Florida at the water treatment plant that we're building. Worker was on top of a concrete wall about 20 feet in the air. Rebar sticking up through. They take what they call a hickey bar, and they bend the rebar to form that horizontal element. And the worker got to one of those, and as he pushed, it slipped. He fell headfirst down towards a concrete slab, and he got caught by a horizontal lifeline I designed. You talk about making your day, making you realize why the Lord put you on the earth. We found one life that day. And so whether it's through this presentation, whether it's through whatever conversations, my hope is that we find one more life. Because if we find one more life, it's worth it. And as we can see from the statistics, there's a lot more lives out there that we can positively affect. So as we finish up, again, I want to thank Sam for inviting me to speak. I want to appreciate all the hospitality from Jackie. And I want to say thank you to Forrest for helping me center how I was going to start out this presentation. I do have plenty of time for questions and answers. I think we have about 10 minutes left. But thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for everything that you do to make sure that workers at height are safe, and I hope to have conversations with you now or in the future. Consider me your fall protection phone a friend. If you have any questions in the future, I, in all seriousness, would rather be woken up at 3:30 in the morning with a question. Now, you might need to ring twice because that whole do not disturb thing on the iPhone. You might have to call back twice in order to get through, but I, in seriousness, would allow to be woken up. And I was able to live that 2 weeks ago. Saudi Aramco had a construction safety improvement presentation, and the presentation was at 10 o'clock Arab time, which was 3 o'clock for me in the morning. So I was able to live my request out there. So again, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your attention. Have a great rest of the show. Appreciate it. We do have a couple minutes for questions, and I promise that I'll stay away from that speaker so we don't get the big wretched sound. Jackie's coming up with the microphone. I love that microphone, by the way.
You can throw it, actually.
Yes, sir.
I just want to say thanks again for coming and joining this.
Sure.
Presentation. Was extremely informative and very relevant, I think, to our conference and association as a whole. You know, you spoke about the hierarchy of controls,
Sure.
but you know, also in the beginning of the presentation, you talked about how, in spite of all the standards that have been implemented since 1995, it hasn't made a big impact. And then
Sure.
you look at what the UK is doing and how successful they've been.
Yeah.
You know, if you were all powerful, if you had the ear of the president in every association, and
Sure.
everybody was going to implement exactly
Okay.
what you wanted to do, what would you do?
So first off, I'm a little offended because you said if I was all powerful. I actually think I am all powerful. No, in all seriousness, no.
You're married, you should know better.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, great point. Thanks, Sam. But in all seriousness, you know, if I could dictate, and so I tried to do that, Sam. I tried to do that back in when OSHA was publishing and doing you know, comments on their subpart D&I. I wrote OSHA and I said, you know, you're proposing to make the general industry regulation consistent with the construction regulation. According to the data that I'm looking at, it's not really helping when it comes to fatalities. So if you make something, and I'm all in favor of consistency because I think it helps us all implement it. But if you make something consistent to something that's not working, then you're going to have two things that aren't working. And so according to my data, you shouldn't do that. Plus, you should add the hierarchy of controls because of the 2005 work at heights regulation from the UK. You should add the hierarchy of controls. And OSHA's response to me was, thank you very much for your comment, which they always say thank you for your comments. Then the second part was, you didn't provide enough data. And this was the thing that really, you know, capped it. We consider all the solutions that we proposed to be equivalently safe. As a safety professional, I object. Right? I object. We all know that if you eliminate a hazard, there's zero chance that somebody could get hurt from that situation, as opposed to using PPE. And that's not even talking about using engineering controls versus PPE. And so when I went over there to London for the Work at Heights seminar back in 2019, it was also our 25th anniversary. So we got to spend a week in Scotland and a week in London, you know, seeing everything. And of course, I'm looking at all the fall protection situations. My wife is looking for all, you know, at all the history and so forth. But what I saw visible differences in what they do. And obviously, you know, your industry is focused on one of those. I saw scaffolding in the town of Canterbury, where they were doing some sort of, you know, work on the roof. I mean, what would they do here? They would have a couple of ladders, and they'd have a couple of you know, maybe a couple of harnesses that they would be using in those cases. And yet, this was, for all intents and purposes, well-built scaffold and really robust enough. And so we have to be mindful of the hierarchy of controls because that's philosophically, that's where safety professionals are in line. And so somebody from the UK, I won't use my words, I'll use someone from Australia and someone in the UK that I have, you know, monthly and every 6 weeks calls with, and they say that we are a very harness-based society here in the United States. And until we address that part, we're not going to be where we need to be. And while I'm not proposing to take any of those regulatory frameworks over here, I realize that's a much more complicated issue than that. But if at some point someone's going to say this is too much, these number of fatalities, these number of serious injuries with days away from work is too much, and we're going to correct it. So if we in this room, if we at the industries that really serve the workers at height, if we can help change the culture, I think it'll be better off. And quite frankly, we need to see more situations where we're using scaffolding versus PPE, because it's going to be much safer in the long run. Obviously, there's some nuances related to that, but in general, that's philosophically what the hierarchy of control tells us. So, thanks for the question, Sam. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Oh, toss the mic.
So in your experience, how many times do you get to deal with a general contractor like we do?
Mm-hmm.
When we build a scaffold, we generate a fall hazard. That's what we do, temporary elevated platform. You get out onto a job site, and first thing general contractor says, hey, it's 100% tie-off.
Yeah.
The safety guy comes out, has no practical experience with what we do building scaffolds, telling us we can't do it right.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, do you ever get the chance to get the general contractor's ear and those safety people's ear to try to educate them a little bit more on how the industry works as a whole?
Absolutely, but it's as you can imagine, it's a large conversation, right? You're talking about changing a big ship with a small rudder, and so the conversation has to start somewhere, right? What's the saying? The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is right now. And so while I wish this would have been worked into the regulation, Subpart M, back in 1995, 20 plus years ago, it wasn't. And so at some point we need to change the tide. It might take 50 years. It might take more than what my career has left in front of me, but it's something that we can achieve. We'll eventually get there. It just depends upon what's going to be the casualties until we do get there. So I'm not trying to minimize how much of a challenge that is for you. You guys are on the front lines. But if you have a group of general contractors and you want me to have this conversation with them, let me know who they are and let's have the conversation. Because fall protection equipment is here to stay, and it's a very, very important way that we protect our workers at heights. But fundamentally, according to the hierarchy of controls, it is not the safest way to protect our workers. And the challenge with the 100% tie-off is, and I have big issues with that, or when someone says fall protection above 6 feet, wherever you're at, is because it desensitizes them to the actual hazard. And so there's a big factor that goes into that. I think as safety professionals, and this is one of the reasons why I'm against the 5,000-pound anchorage, is that when we're talking to the worker out there in the field and we say, well, your anchorage has to be 5,000 pounds, and oh, by the way, your clearances have to be 18.5 feet. When we start doing those things, and they start, as Dan Henn indicated and suggested I use, visualize the outcomes, they know that that's not reality. And so what happens is they start discounting everything that we say. And very similar to, tie off above 6 feet or whatever else they want to say, it desensitizes them to the actual hazard. And so that's a part of the conversation that we have to have, and we have to start talking more with facts versus exaggerations. And we need to, get into situations where your life is at risk if you make this one mistake. I'd rather have that conversation than just generically. I understand why they do that, but as one organization, the construction industry, after we did some of these items in a lot more detail, they said we used to look up and say, was that person tied off? Are they using fall protection equipment? Now we're looking at their system and saying, where exactly are you tied off? Are you going to strike the edge? What kind of clearances do you have? What kind of swing fall? We just need to continue to advance that conversation. People are using harnesses now if they have them. We just need to elevate the conversation. So, not sure if did that answer your question well enough, as well as I could? Yeah. Great, thank you. I'll be here tonight. I'll be at the reception, so maybe you can get more out of me if I have a drink or two in me, but for all intents and purposes, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for all the hospitality you've shown me, and I look forward to the conversations in the future. Everyone have a great rest of the day.